Hello everybody, this is Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by Henry Jackman. In 2006, Henry Jackman entered the world of film scoring. As of then, he started writing additional music and arrangements on films such as Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, Pirates 3 at World's End, The Simpsons Movie, The Da Vinci Code and The Dark Knight. As of 2010, Henry started his solo career and he quickly became one of the most in-demand composers. His list of credits includes Henry IV, X-Men First Class, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, Captain Phillips, Kingsman, Jack Reacher Never Go Back, Jumanji, The Predator as well as Pokémon Detective Pikachu. Welcome Henry.
Hey, thanks for having me. You know what else I'd sling in that list, because I'm so keen on I like the director so much, is the Captain America movies, the second and the third one.
Yes, of course. I like those scores a lot. Sorry I didn't mention it. I had to compress the list.
No, I was thinking more about. I was thinking less about the music and more about not wanting to leave out Joe and Anthony Russo, because they're such good directors.
Absolutely, he's a wonderful director, and I just had to compress my list a little, so I'm sorry about that one. Henry, thank you for joining me. Before you started writing film scores, you had been working with artists such as Mike Oldfield, Elton John, and also Seal. You produced songs, and you also did some mixing and programming. How did you get started in this business back then?
Well, that's a really good question. In fact, you know what? No one's asked me, just because, things are usually about film music. It's almost difficult for me to remember, since moving to film music, it's almost like a separate part of my life. But I forget I had this whole, not particularly successful career in the record industry before film music. Well, I shouldn't say that. I was very lucky and fortunate to work with all sorts of, very talented people, not least Trevor Horn, who was is a legendary record producer. But I guess the simplest way, I had a very formal education in music, which doesn't really answer. I'll get to the answer to your question is more to do with the professional career. But I actually had an incredibly strict classical education. I went to a cathedral choir school, singing in St. Paul's Cathedral, every day for 5 years. It was a bit like a Harry Potter boarding school. And it was all very, very strict, very formal, everything classical. But I was very lucky because my father was eclectic, and so he was a composer, but he enjoyed all kinds of music. And in fact, my father had a number 3 hit in Spain called "The Flower Pot Man" in the '60s, right? So my father liked Bela Bartok and Benjamin Britten, but he also loved Paul Simon and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and so he was very eclectic. So I guess my first opportunities, I then sort of rebelled, having had all this incredibly strict classical education. I started just privately messing around with an 8-bit sampler on my home computer, to the despair of my poor mother, who'd watch me, play Brahms Rhapsodies when I was like 11 years old and when I was 16 playing for the Queen of England and all the rest of it. Suddenly now I was making like rave music in the bedroom with an 8-bit sampler that went like, So she was obviously a bit disappointed. So I was already privately having my own like electronic rebellion. But then, as it turned out, my dad's youngest brother, Greg Jackman, was working with Trevor Horn quite a lot. My uncle Greg Jackman had his own distinguished career as an engineer, working with all sorts of bands, not least like the Moody Blues. I mean, I think my uncle's recorded Prince, Michael Jackson, Paul McCartney. He had this amazing career. So when I sort of abandoned my classical past, and round about 20, I was hanging out with my Uncle Greg when he was mixing at Psalm Studios. So I got to meet Trevor Horn and all this sort of thing. So I kind of started off as an extremely unimportant guy at the back of the room, sort of putting cables in the back of a sampler and making sure everyone had a coffee, really. And then sort of, just developed some of the names you mentioned. I did some stuff with Mike Oldfield. I worked at Psalm with Trevor Horn on Art of Noise stuff. And ended up, the culmination of that was working with Seal in 2001. And at that point, it's really weird, given that I'd had years of this classical upbringing. At that point, I had no thought about film music at all. I was probably just trying to be too cool for school. You know what I mean? I kind of didn't want anyone to know that I could play, Debussy and Chopin preludes on a piano, because I was too busy banging out beats and, trying to be cool. Anyway, at some point I bumped into Hans Zimmer, who just went, "You are wasting your time in the record industry." Because I had this long chat with him, and he was way ahead of me because he's smart and, he's a bit of a legend in film music. And he kind of figured me out and went, "Look, you're one of these guys who's had all this symphonic and classical education, and you're just hiding it all and pretending to be cool. You're an idiot. You should be doing film music." I was like, "All right, okay." I'm not going to argue. I don't know why it's a very difficult industry to break into, but to be honest, I'd never even had the thought. When I was working with Seal, I was just mostly focused on, making a great sounding album. I used to love stuff, like late 90s Bjork albums. I just wasn't thinking about film music. I thought film music was something that old people did, And so then I was very fortunate that Hans heard this. I'd done this album called Transfiguration, which was my own pretty feeble attempt. I really thought that Bjork's album in the late 90s, Vespertine and Homogenic, were really, really, I don't know, just very inspiring. And I just did this album called Transfiguration that had real strings, real choir, but then a lot of electronica. It was a whole mix of stuff. It was my attempt to try and do something as cool as the kind of music that I liked at the time. Anyway, Hans Zimmer heard this Transfiguration thing and went, "Oh, whoever did this is actually not an idiot. Like, where is he? Let's go talk to him." Which was just very fortunate. I mean, you need lucky breaks, don't you? I mean, I guess that could have never happened. And because it's all very well having the thought, hey, maybe I should be doing film music, but it's not just going to happen. And then I basically served an apprenticeship with Hans, which is the best way. All the education I'd had been really formal and intellectual. I'd never had any experience at all of writing to picture. I mean, when you work with Trevor Horn, you spend like 3 years on one album. And it's certainly not to picture, and it's these huge productions. So I had no experience of the whole discipline of writing to picture. Although it made complete sense, because one of the things, when I was working in the record industry, I used to get a bit frustrated, because if you've got a musical background where you've studied everything or performed and sung in orchestras and choirs, and you're familiar with music all the way from like 15th century church music all through Baroque and classical and 20th century orchestral music, as well as all the electronic music I loved, you get a bit frustrated, because it's like you've got this big garage with hundreds of paints in it, and you want to use all the paints. But in pop music, you're not often required to do anything that sounds like, all these other symphonic styles are not really needed in pop music. So once I started doing film music, I was like, oh, I get it. This is such a relief, because the great thing about film music is, depending on the movie, there's so many different kind of things that you might be required to do. It could be anything from sounding a little bit like 19th century German symphonic music. It could be like purely electronic. It could be, there are so many bases you need to cover that suddenly you get to use all your paint pots.
So Hans is basically the one who convinced you to write film music. But what is your definition of a good film composer and a good musical storyteller?
Well, you said it actually in the last part of the sentence. In fact, when I first met Hans, we had this really interesting, wide-ranging conversation about music. I mean, I think I was very lucky. One of the other things was Hans had to write something or other, and I think he was procrastinating. He was trying to find a way to avoid this piece that he needed to write, and that's when I showed up to have a chat with him, so that it was very welcome for him to be able to waste a good 3 hours talking to me, pretending it was an important meeting, so he could avoid. So it's another, I got lucky again. But we were talking about everything from plain song to Strauss to German techno and house and drum and bass and the God knows what. It was just an endless conversation about music. And then I'm very confident talking about all of that, because like I say, I've been studying music all my life. And being involved in it. But then the really important thing he said, which of course I would not have understood at the time because I hadn't done film music, he goes, well, of course, the thing about being a film composer is it's not really about music. So, which is a very provocative sentence. I was like, well, right, so you're saying being a film composer isn't to do with music? I'm not quite sure I understand that sentence. And he goes, no, it's to do with telling story. The really, if you want to be a good film composer, the number one objective is not writing music. The number one objective is telling story, and then you use music to tell story. But it's that way round. Because you can have a genius composer. I mean, take Stravinsky. Stravinsky, famous, I can't remember what the movie was asked to do a film score and wrote some fantastic music, as you'd expect. He's one of the greatest composers in the history of Western music, but it didn't help the film, and he had no interest in what it was supposed to do for the movie. So the point is that where you're going to be most useful to a director and to anyone in a filmmaking project is not just that you're satisfying yourself to write whatever music you feel like writing, but that you spend time understanding what is the narrative content of the movie and what are the characters and what the movie might be missing or what it needs enhancing and what music can do to benefit the story. And you figure that out first, and then you start thinking about what the music needs to do, which is very different to being, if you're a singer-songwriter or you're a recording artist, you don't think like that. You write songs about what you're feeling or about how you want to connect with other people. And you don't start from the premise that there's already an existing narrative and you have to figure out how to enhance it or how you're going to interact with it. And so even though I didn't understand, obviously if you meet someone for the first time and they go, oh, by the way, film music isn't to do with music, it's a deliberately provocative sentence to make you think differently. And many years later, I really remembered that sentence and going, yeah, no, he's absolutely right. The most important thing about film music is narrative and story, and then it's how you compose, but with the objective of enhancing the story. The priority is the narrative.
Henry, if I'm not mistaken, Alan Silvestri is one of your favorite composers.
Oh yeah,
and
he's fantastic. Yeah.
sometimes I can hear some influence in your music, for instance in Jumanji. Do you at times try to play homage to him deliberately?
It's not conscious in any particular piece that I write, but there's no denying, I won't bore you, I've probably said so many times in an interview, my first experience of when I was a kid at some quite repressive English boarding school, and we were watching Predator. We weren't supposed to, we were like 13 or something. And we sneaked illegally into the senior boys' room and stole the VHS player so that we could watch a bootleg copy of Predator. And I'd never really concentrated on them. I was studying, I was at school and had to play like Scriabin and Debussy piano preludes and whatnot. And anyway, we were watching this movie and I was going, wait a minute, the music sounds as good as, the music sounds a bit like Rimsky-Korsakov. Some of the harmonies are as good as the kind of stuff I'm studying at music college. And like no one else cared. All the other boys were like, oh, shut up, Jackman. And I'm trying to watch the movie. And then when the credits came up, I was like, I'm going to have to remember, like, who was that? And this wobbly, because it was a bootleg copy, this wobbly name came up saying Alan Silvestri. And I just thought Predator was genius because of most people go and watch movies, don't care. They're not concentrating on the music, and they're certainly not concentrating on the harmonic language used in a score. But because I was at music college, I then, went to the piano and figured out that the scales he were using were not diatonic scales. They were octatonic scales. And it reminded me of a passage in Rimsky-Korsakov. I was like, wow, this guy is serious. That's proper, that's grown up real music. That's not like wallpaper filler. This guy is really good. And I've always loved that scale, the octatonic scale, which Alan used a lot in Predator. I've always liked it. Just even before Predator, I liked it when I ever came across that scale in my classical studies. I've always loved it. Diatonic scale goes, and an octatonic scale goes, or it's a really cool, very mysterious scale, and Predator's full of it. So that influence, yeah, I would say. Also, he just, funnily enough, Alan's so humble. Alan's orchestra, I like the fact that he uses the orchestra when he wants to, it's used in its proper like symphonic way, symphonic context. And I just love a lot of his orchestration. I remember talking to him, and he goes, "Oh, I didn't know what I was." He says, "Oh, when I did Back to the Future, I didn't know how to write for. I'd never written for an orchestra. I had no idea what I was doing." And I remember thinking, "Wow, if Back to the Future is your version of not knowing how to write for an orchestra, then you're some kind of natural genius." So he's just an instinctive genius. I mean, I don't think he wasn't lying or anything. I mean, he didn't have a whole background of writing loads of symphonic music. I think he used to do more like band, big band arrangements and band arrangements and whatnot. And he didn't consider himself a film composer. And somehow or other, he got the gig for Back to the Future. But you listen to that orchestration, and it's in a similar ballpark to John Williams. But he didn't have a whole background in it. He just felt his way to it, instinctively. And same thing when I spoke to him about Predator, because I love how he used these interesting harmonies and scales and whatnot. And I remember talking to him about it. And again, I don't know if he was just being really humble. He said, "Oh, all I remember about Predator is I felt like I didn't really know what I was doing." And so, I just think he's has an incredibly high level of natural musical and compositional talent, and so I've just always enjoyed his scores.
Yeah, I mean, those scores are great. I mean, the first Predator came out in 87 and the second one, I believe, in 90 or 91. So
That's right.
So his career was already in full swing, so to speak. I mean, when he did Back to the Future, it was 85, and you're right, he actually did some band arrangements and all that stuff. But it's an interesting way of looking at it, that someone who doesn't really believe he has this huge knowledge about orchestral writing actually is able to deliver this huge score.
Yeah. Well, he's just, that's just natural talent, I think.
And Henry, when you got more experience, what do you think was more important starting out and learning the ropes? Do you think it was learning how to write a cue or to speak the filmmaker's language?
Ooh, that's a good question. They're two parts of the same. I mean, you're going to fail if you don't have one or the other. One of the great things about serving an apprenticeship in helping out with arrangement of certain cues and whatnot before the whole responsibility is yours is then you're concentrating, as it were, just on the craft, right? You're not having to worry about the filmmakers or the big overall picture. You haven't written the themes. You didn't have to come up with the ideas. You're more like one of those guys building a Gothic cathedral, and you're working on the roof, but you didn't have to design the whole cathedral. But it's really important you know how to build a roof, and you know how to build an arch, and you know how to build the nave and the transept, and you need to know how to build the building before you try and design one. So it's a bit like you need to be an engineer and an architect. So it's important to know all the craft and the detail of how to handle a scene, how to reharmonize themes, how to deconstruct themes, how to make things work for individual scenes. And then later on, if you get the full responsibility to be an overall composer, then you enter the I don't know what you call it, more like executive responsibilities of like, now you're the one coming up with the ideas, you're the one coming up with the themes, you're the one trying to convince the director this is a good idea, this is a bad idea, we should do this, we should do that. And now you're talking to the filmmakers, and it's a much more senior thing, but you need to be able to do both, basically. But it's a good start in terms of apprenticeship. It's good to start off by being assigned certain arrangements and responsibilities without having to build the whole cathedral. And then once you're confident in having a certain amount of skill, because once you get into being a composer, a named composer, a lot of it is political as well. You've got to know all the musical stuff, but then there's a whole load of other things that come into play to do with directors and producers and studios, and not everything's always, when you're lucky, it's all harmonious, but sometimes you could have a director whose idea for the music could be very different to the producer, and there's a political battle going on and all the rest of it, and you need to know how to navigate all of that. And that's not really to do with music, that's really political. So if you try and learn all of it in 5 minutes, you're going to get overwhelmed. But, you know, like anything, if you, that's why I think apprenticeship is such a good thing.
As of 2010, you started getting your first main credits on a film. You did Henry 4, which is a prime example. And when you work on a film as the main composer, how would you describe this feeling knowing you are the chief architect of the score?
It depends how many you've done. The first really big film, the first film really I did was for DreamWorks Animation, Monsters vs. Aliens. And it being my first, I mean, it was a bit of a tall order. It's like the first, a lot of people have been working for years, you know, working on TV or doing stuff and work their way up. I mean, it all happened very quickly. So very quickly, I was the composer for Monsters vs. Aliens. So that was pretty strenuous because, you know, I mean, in answer to your question, what does it feel like? Then it was, well, I wouldn't say it was overwhelming, but it was a serious burden because I was, you know, it was a big film working with Jeffrey Katzenberg, who's this big Hollywood mogul. And it's the very first thing I did. Now, just like anything in life, if it being your first film, you feel very differently to when it's film number 25. There's slightly less panic about it because you know, you've been there before. I bet if you're a soccer player or football player, as you say in England, if you're, 19 years old and you go into the Champions League final for the first time, that's going to feel very different to if you're a more senior member of the team and you've been in the Champions League 6 years running and it's another final. It's a different experience because you know you can do it. But certainly the very first super large project that you do has an added I don't know what you call it, has an added weight to it because of course you've never got through it. You might not, for all you know, you might not make it. But no, so it's a good test of character, really.
Henry, in 2013, you scored the acclaimed film Captain Phillips, starring Tom Hanks. If I may ask, how would you describe your work on this film, which was directed by Paul Greengrass?
Well, Paul Greengrass is a very interesting filmmaker because if you compare that with something like Captain America, which has a big opinionated score with, especially Winter Soldier has like a very aggressive theme and, it can be pretty bombastic and it's a certain kind of filmmaking. Paul Greengrass is almost the opposite to that. Paul Greengrass's background was as a journalist and a documentary maker. So his personal taste with music was pretty challenging, but also very educational. Meaning, he almost wanted, because he wanted Captain Phillips not to have a narrative opinion. He didn't want a movie where like the Americans are the good guys and the Somali pirates are the bad guys. So he didn't want theme, and he almost didn't want music to have any opinion of any kind, which produces a very, very minimalist approach to music, which was an education for me. I wouldn't want to do that for my whole career because it's like a version of how much can you strip out the narrative content of music to be as neutral and as objective as possible, which I'm not criticizing. That absolutely served his purpose of making an objective and unbiased film where you end up feeling sympathy for the Somali teenagers or young men, who've ended up being pirates, and the music's not allowed to weight the film, and the music's not allowed to tell the audience what they're supposed to be feeling. So it's a much more guarded and it's a much more minimalist approach. But it was educational because I would write something that I thought was pretty minimalist and had very little. It wasn't biased in any way. And Paul would go, "Oh, this is interesting. I still think it's too acrobatic and it's too informative." I'd be like, "Wow, really?" It would be. But it was a really interesting lesson. It would be a bit like saying, okay, so I want you to paint something, but don't make it narrative. Keep it abstract and make it simple. So you go, oh, okay, fine. So I'm going to do something a bit like Mondrian, where you have like 3 circles, 2 squares, a triangle, and like 4 lines with a few different colors. And then he looks and goes, no, it's way too busy. So you go, all right. So we'll do 2 triangles, 1 square, 1 circle, and just 1 line. And he goes, yeah, it's still too busy. Like, wow, okay, we'll do one square, one circle, and then just one line. He's like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Just get rid of the line and then cut the square in half. Like, okay, wow. So now we got a huge canvas with one circle and half a square on it. And if you know what you're doing, you can still write music that really serves the film. So it was definitely, I definitely admired his approach of keeping almost like a documentary and journalistic objectivity to make that film, which is why the film didn't feel like a cheesy film where like the Americans have come to rescue Captain Phillips and the Somalis are all bad guys. It didn't feel like that at all. By the time you get to the end of that movie, you end up feeling an overall objective sadness for the state of the world. You feel bad for the pirates who are like economically forced into this crappy way of making money, and you feel sorry for the poor, American dudes who got captured on their own ship. So and part of that is not only his filmmaking style and the way he works with actors, it's the way he insisted that the music could never be heroic and it couldn't be too tragic, nor could it be too scary. It had to always stay in this very objective area. So it was quite educational.
Great. Henry, at the beginning you also mentioned, or we talked about Captain America briefly, and it's not the only action score you've written. You've done quite a few of those, and you worked on Jack Reacher and The Predator and Jumanji. What is your definition of a modern action score? What do you think those films need these days? And what do the filmmakers look for? How would you translate that in your own musical language?
Well, it's funny when you ask like what is a definition of a modern action score, I don't really think about it like that. I mean, I'll answer the question, but the funny thing is when you do a movie, you're so focused on the exact mechanics of the movie in front of you, as it were, that you end up you'd need almost to have like a year-long holiday to have a more abstract thought about like analyze what is a modern action score. But you know what I mean? Because once you get a cut of the film, you're so focused on coming up with a vocabulary and a texture and a sound and whatever themes are needed for that specific film that you're driven more by that than by a cultural zeitgeist of what you think a modern action score is. Having said that, it's a pretty straightforward analysis to think that it's not always that there are no rules, absolutely no rules, but given all that's happened to music there's a hell of a lot of ways to make music that don't involve a symphony orchestra, all the way from like folk music through rock music, and then when I started to get really excited about it when I was a teenager, a lot of like electronic music. So there's a whole load of especially when it comes to aggressive stuff, there's a whole load of textures available that don't come from the orchestra. I mean, if you listen to that track on the Winter Soldier CD that's just called The Winter Soldier, the first 4 minutes of that doesn't have any orchestra in at all. It's more the kind of sounds you'd get in drum and bass or dubstep or whatever. So it's a long-winded answer to the question, but I would say if a movie is contemporary and it's not a period piece, it would seem a bit obtuse to not use some of the techniques that are used in modern music. Anything from distorted grooves and like any kind of using samples and synths and whatnot. Some people like to be really purist. There's certain things, like if you're doing Harry Potter, that's not going to be covered in crunchy distorted drums. It's not going to be heavily influenced by the history of electronic music. But wherever possible, it would seem natural, because my upbringing is like half super disciplined classical upbringing, and then I've had all this other influence from working in pop music, working in electronic music. So it feels fairly like Pikachu, for example. Some of the cues towards the end of Pikachu are very symphonic, and then other cues like Rhyme City are like a sort of hybrid, of all these different techniques, using orchestra and using synths and programming and all kinds of different stuff. So that just comes back to the paint pot thing. If you've got loads of paint pots, not all of them are symphonic. Other paint pots are to do with production techniques and engineering and all the rest of it. So it depends on the movie, but if something is very contemporary, it would seem somewhat obscure to deliberately avoid using any contemporary production techniques, you know.
You just mentioned the Pokemon Detective Pikachu, which was released a couple of weeks ago, and it is the very first live-action film adaptation of the whole Pokemon franchise, if you will, which has been so hugely popular for many years. There have been video games, lots of comics. Now it made it onto the big screen. What made you want to score this film?
Well, I like, it's funny, I like, very often I'll be enjoying a TV show, right, where I love the show itself, but I wouldn't want to do the music, because even though I love the show, the requirements for the music are not very ambitious. That often happens in TV. Not always. Some TV has very ambitious music and it's great, but very often, you know, you can very much enjoy watching a TV show, but as a composer, you wouldn't want to, if you're fortunate enough to choose your career, it's not ambitious enough. So the reason I like things like Wreck-It Ralph and Detective Pikachu is, especially with Pikachu, it didn't exist. You know, I had to create this as yet non-existent musical universe. It's very ambitious because what's happening is, you know, we're making this Pokemon world is being translated onto the screen for the first time with live action, and it needs a musical language which formally doesn't exist. So really it's an invitation, as well as, you know, writing all the cues for the score, you're being invited to create and invent the sound of this universe, which is always quite appealing because it's like a blank canvas. It's quite ambitious. You know, it's not a fixed thing. I mean, even if you were an amazing Renaissance painter like Caravaggio, or you're being asked to do the same thing. You have to paint the crucifixion of Christ, or you have to paint, you know, the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary. You can put your own angle on it, but they're fixed subjects. Whereas when you're asked to do the music for Wreck-It Ralph or Detective Pikachu, these are worlds that don't actually exist. So it's exciting to be asked, hey, like for example, on Wreck-It Ralph Breaks the Internet, you know, it's like, so Henry, the really important cue is when they get sucked down, you know, the router tubes and end up being propelled into the internet. So we're going to need a cue that represents the internet. You know, and I spent ages on that track because it's I won't go into huge detail about it, but it was a cue that I really had to sort of invent what that universe sounded like. And it's the same with Detective Pikachu, in that it's got some film noir aspects. It's actually got some like Pokemon thing. It's got some like 80s synth aspects. It's got some really big orchestra towards the end, some symphonic. It's a whole mixture of things. But the invitation to create a previously non-existent musical universe is not just the theme, it's the tone and the sounds. And that's always a really exciting thing to do, because there are fewer lines laid down as to what it's expected to sound like.
You just mentioned you used the full orchestra, which is pretty apparent when you listen to the score. And you also use great synth sounds. Did you opt for analog synth equipment, or
yeah. No, I went crazy on. There are almost no plugins. I drive myself crazy because in the modern world of plugins, things are a lot quicker. It's a lot easier dealing with plugins. A lot of that stuff in Pikachu is the original Roland MKS 50, which is from like 1979, 1980, something like that. There's a lot of SH5, which is even from the 70s, Juno 106, and the original Korg MS-20, not the new digital one, the original one. And it's just a lot more work because real analog synths are temperamental and they go out of tune, and you know, some of them they don't have all the MIDI controls and everything, but I just much prefer the sound. So Rhyme City, I spent about 7 weeks making Rhyme City, and like a bit like an old Trevor Horn production or something. It is all analog, all the synths, original analog synths.
How did you conceptualize the score?
I think I knew I needed a father theme because of how strong a point in the story that is. And then because I knew I wanted to use a lot of these synths, I knew as well as a theme, I wanted to have some hooks, you know, like this thing that goes. that kind of thing. There's quite a few, because that kind of thing is a certain idiom with those kind of synths, you know. I think I spent a while writing this suite. It was about a 6-minute long suite where I got my themes going, I got my hooks going, and I started using all these synths to come up with this overall like 5 or 6 minute piece to show the director as a presentation of what I think the world should sound like. And you know, he loved it because he loves, you know, his thing was like, I don't know how you're gonna, you know, it has to have a Pokemon aspect, which I guess would mean synth and a certain nostalgia, but also, you know, the movie gets big and it's going to have orchestra. And I said, don't worry, I think those two things, you can marry the, you know, throughout the score, we're going to be able to have both of those things. We'll have the synths, the nostalgia, the hooks, the themes. And then if you start listening to the cues towards the end of the CD, you know, it starts getting really big and symphonic. And, you know, you can have your cake and eat it. You can use all of those different styles to get to help the narrative.
Henry, if I remember correctly, for the end credits of the film, you also incorporated one of the Pokemon themes of the past, and you also transitioned into, I think, the Rhyme City theme, which you wrote. But the Pokemon theme was not included on this.
I know, it's a great shame. That's a great shame. That was nothing to do with me. That was some legal requirement. It's very complicated. When you have, this is all above my pay grade, but when you have themes pertaining to, you know, the Pokemon universe and the various legal requirements and this, that, and the other, when I inquired, I was told that that particular track that I did an arrangement for at the end was not allowed to go on the soundtrack CD. And I have no idea why. Something to do with the licensing or the legal way that the Pokemon universe works. But it was a shame, but I was not allowed to put that on the CD.
Were you also not allowed to use more themes for the movie itself because of legal issues?
We used exactly the amount we wanted to in the movie. It was just that we couldn't put it on the CD.
How did you deal with the post-production deadline on this film versus times you were less experienced? Did you have to do many rewrites on Pokemon?
No, not really. I mean, it was no different to any other. I mean, a lot of these big films have a hell of a lot of special effects, but it doesn't really affect. Even if you're writing music without the finished effects, it doesn't affect the overall structure and the narrative of the scene. It just means the graphics get better and better. I mean, occasionally I've had to write, you know, sometimes when you do animation and they're changing bits, you have to write music to storyboards while they're redoing something. So, I mean, it was never like that. Every time, throughout the process of writing music, the structure, the assembly of the film was always sufficient to do what needed to happen. And there was also ample time. The distance between the director's first cut and and finishing the scoring, it really didn't feel. I've had a lot more hairy situations. It was pretty smooth the way it went forward, and the fact that there are always new cuts of the movie coming in with the updated special effects doesn't really completely upset the creative process. That gets more tricky when people can't decide what they're doing and the actual edit is changing a lot and scenes are going in and going out and that kind of thing. That can get more tricky. But the version that ended up in the cinema was fairly close to the first version I saw. It was just, visual effects updates and this kind of thing. The director had it pretty well under control. So that you didn't have that, because sometimes you can have a chaotic situation where you're going around in circles because you're writing music for scenes that don't exist a week later. That certainly didn't happen. It was a much smoother process.
Henry, as I understand, you have no less than 3 films in post-production currently, 21 Bridges, Dhaka, and also Mosul. And 21 Bridges opens up in July. Can you already disclose some info on that picture?
You know what? I'm going to avoid that just because I don't know if I'm supposed to say anything about it. And just in case I'm not, I won't say anything about it. Other than I'm sure you can see on IMDb, the phenomenally talented directors who directed the last 2 Avengers films, Joe and Anthony Russo, are producing that film, So that's why, having worked with them on Winter Soldier and the third Captain America movie, I was very happy to get involved in that, and it's a pretty cool movie.
Great, looking forward to it. Henry, is there anything else on your mind? Do you have anything else you would like to add?
No, I think that was a really good question.
Henry, thanks again for taking so much time out of your schedule. I hope we get to do many more interviews in the future.
Great.
And I love talking to you, and I hope you have a nice day.
And same to you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.